You know those dirty hippies who gathered in a New York City park last week and were finally evicted for hygiene reasons? Seriously, I'm not calling them dirty hippies as an insult. I'm calling them dirty hippies because they didn't leave that New York park for a week. It was pretty gross. They thought that going to the bathroom on a police car is a form of democratic protest. Yeah, dirty hippies. Now, they're not all hippies. Some of them are 60s types who want to relive the sit-in experiences of their youth. But some of them are professional protesters, folks who go out whenever there's a chance to be countercultural. These are the black bloc types who came to agitate in Toronto during the G20, and there was even a few of them in Vancouver during the Stanley Cup riots. Of course, well-financed, simultaneous protests in different cities with PR spin doctors and lawyers and electric PR sound systems don't just happen spontaneously, especially when they're allegedly organized by anarchists. The Occupy Wall Street protest began in New York City, and as Andrew Breitbart showed us last week, they're orchestrated by big government labor unions, like the SEIU in the States. Here's proof. Here's a union boss who was in charge of the Los Angeles protest who was monitoring Breitbart when he went to check it out. Look at this.
Anthony Navarrete, General Services Worksite Organizer, SEIU. So you're my minder. But you're following me everywhere I go.
Yeah.
Why?
Huh? I have the right to be out here, just like you do.
So you're following me wherever I go.
I have the right to be out here, just like you.
You have the right to basically stalk me.
I have the right to be here, just like you.
So when I walk 10 feet to my right, you're going to be there?
I have the right to be here, just like you.
Yeah, really grassroots, really spontaneous, eh? Look, I understand why the government unions have come up with this Occupy Wall Street scheme. It's actually pretty smart. It's an attempt to shift the blame for the U.S. recession away from the White House and onto someone else other than the Democratic Party. I mean, banks are still failing in the United States. Unemployment there is over 9%. Annual deficits in the States are $1.5 trillion. And the U.S. lost its AAA credit rating. And company after company keeps getting a bailout, including huge banks, all on President Hope and Change's watch. So yeah, shift the blame onto anyone else before the 2012 presidential elections. I get it. They've come up with slogans like these protesters represent 99% of Americans and that Wall Street represents the richest 1%. It's about class warfare. They say that themselves, which is pretty much Obama's own talking point about taking on people flying corporate jets. Look, it's about Marxism, which was Obama's father's creed. In fact, it's how Obama's mom and dad met. They were both Marxist students at the University of Hawaii together. That's their family belief system. Even the bizarre assemblies of these Occupy protests are creepily Soviet. Masses of people mouthing the exact same words as their fearless leaders and then having non-secret votes about it. I mean, seriously, check out this footage from an Occupy protest in the States where they're using the same weird call and respond business they were doing so in Canada. Like the leader speaks and then they just sort of repeat it. Anyways, repeating the nutty propaganda of your leaders verbatim and then having non-secret votes, what's the word for that? These people's meetings in public places with no privacy where the discussion is tightly scripted by Marxist leaders? Well, the word for that, for such a council, is known in a Russian term, Soviet. That's what the word Soviet means. It's a people's council, as in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, as in USSR. You know what those other words means, Union and Republic and Socialist, but now you know what the word Soviet means. That's the Occupy movement for you. They are Soviet in the original meaning of the word. So it's about jealousy. It's about the politics of jealousy. If it were about helping people, they wouldn't be angry at the top 1%. They would be trying to help the bottom 5 or 10%. It would be about charity. But it's not about charity, it's about envy, which is weird coming from a movement sponsored by rich unions. I mean, here's a Craigslist classified ad offering to pay protesters $650 a week to protest. Must be nice to have that kind of dough to throw around for a spontaneous grassroots protest. So that's what's going on in the States. But you know, none of those issues really click here in Canada. I mean, we haven't had a single Canadian bank fail, not one. So not one Canadian bank has been bailed out, not one, not $1. Our unemployment rate is about 7%, which is 2% lower than the U.S. And 7% unemployment, by the way, is lower than it was in Canada during the 1990s, which is generally regarded as a boom time. Our national deficit is down to $33 billion. It's still big. But to put that in context, if it were proportionately as big as the U.S. deficit, we'd be 5 times bigger, $150 billion in deficit. Our credit rating in Canada is golden. Our Conservative Prime Minister won the biggest majority in Parliament since the 2000 election. So while things here could always be better, we're pretty much the cat's meow, the bee's knees, which is why so few people bothered to show up for the Occupy Toronto and Occupy Bay Street and Occupy Vancouver protests over the weekend. I mean, there were some in America, but in Canada, most people were pretty much focused on occupying their couches and watching TV or occupying the park on one of the last nice weekends of the year. Now, this morning, according to the left-wing Toronto Star, there were only 20 protesters left in Toronto's financial district. Seriously, 20. How did they even know it was a protest? I mean, that's a regular street corner just waiting for the walk now sign for pedestrians. I mean, there are longer lineups at Toronto hot dog carts in the financial sector. I mean, now it's true that yesterday there were over 100 folks out in Toronto. Not bad for a city of 5 million people. Next weekend is Toronto's annual Zombie Walk. That's where people dress up in Halloween costumes and stagger down the street for fun. I bet you a ruble or a kopeck that there will be more people in next weekend's Zombie Walk than there were this weekend's Occupy protest. And in Calgary, the Zombie Walk and the Occupy protest both happened on the same day on the weekend. There were far more zombies than protesters. I'll have a scientific analysis at this point later in the show, but here's my point. The protests don't really click up here. The issues don't apply. Our banks didn't fail. There were no bailouts out here. Actually, that's not quite true. There was a bailout. The only bailout of any serious size was when Obama forced Canada to go along with his bailout of GM and Chrysler by threatening to shut down the Canadian side of the auto industry if we didn't play along. So really, the only Canadian bailout wasn't a big business. It was a big labor, the Canadian auto workers, which is probably why there wasn't an Occupy Windsor rally. Now, coast to coast, there might have been maybe 500 people total protesting altogether, maybe. But the government broadcaster, the CBC, went into Olympic-style mega coverage of this, sending out literally dozens of reporters and producers and directors to cover the event as if it were huge, as if it were an election. In fact, psychologically, I think that's actually what they were doing. They were trying to have a do-over of the last federal election when Stephen Harper actually crushed the leftist opposition. So look at this website, for example, this interactive election-style page that the CBC painstakingly built of all the protests. They built this in advance, so they were actually part of the Occupy PR movement. They helped organize and promote the protests. But look, if you actually click on a page, say on Calgary there, you see there were really only 3 little tents and a handful of people who showed up. You could fit them all in one Volkswagen hippie bus. But the CBC was not deterred by the fact that the country didn't share their ideological zeal. I mean, check out the exuberant coverage they gave this non-event. Here's a clip.
They're armed with drums and guitars, protest signs and slogans, a mix of union activists, anti-poverty crusaders, and anarchists. It's a day of protest right across Canada as the Occupy Wall Street movements arrived on Bay Street and spread to every corner of this country. We have reporters from coast to coast to coast.
Well, she's practically jumping up and down with excitement. Did you know there were Occupy protests from coast to coast to coast right across the country? Now, when people say coast to coast to coast, they typically mean the Pacific, the Atlantic, and the Arctic Oceans. Of course, there were no protests in the north or in the prairies or even really outside of a tiny block in downtown Toronto, Montreal. I mean, you could count the protesters in the dozens. The CBC wasn't reporting the news. It was making up the news. It was doing PR for these Canadian Soviets. Check out this excitable fella from the CBC.
More than 1,000 cities, hundreds, even thousands of protesters in each. Today, the once tiny grassroots movement against corporate greed turned into a truly global phenomenon. The Occupy protests were peaceful virtually everywhere, save one city overseas. Here in Canada, where confrontations were anticipated, all was calm. We begin our coverage in Toronto, where the biggest Canadian crowd gathered and where the CBC's Adrian Arsenault is right now.
Did you hear how we started that? More than 1,000 cities with hundreds or thousands in each. Do you really believe that? Can you list 1,000? I mean, look at that CBC infographic. Again, I mean, there's only 11 cities in Canada, and some of them had as few as 10 people in attendance. There were more reporters there. I've read the papers this morning and done Google searches. It is simply a lie to say there were more than 1,000 protests, and each had hundreds or thousands of people at them. That is not the news. That is CBC propaganda. That is the state broadcaster lying to promote its union mentality. Remember that no fewer than 10 left-wing labor unions live within the bowels of the CBC, and that affects their news coverage. Here's one more CBC clip because they just couldn't help themselves.
From Wall Street to Bay Street, anger over the worldwide economic crisis hits Canada's largest city. Demonstrators are occupying Toronto's financial district at this hour. Some are armed with signs, others sleeping bags for what looks to be more than just a one-day protest.
Did they really occupy the financial district? I mean, that would take 100,000 people. I think it's going to take more than 20 people that the Toronto says were there, Star says were there today. I mean, anger over the worldwide economic crisis, is that really what's going on in the streets of Toronto? Anger? You know, we have the strongest economy in the G8. Not a single bank failure, but the CBC is angry for you. Again, the CBC is not reporting the news. They are reading from their union's talking points and sending you their $1.1 billion bill. Look, the CBC was engaging in a telethon for the Occupy movement. You know, like when Jerry Lewis raises money for MS, he's on TV all day long, romancing it, trying to get you to chip in. Same thing here. The CBC put dozens of staff on this non-story, and when the event was a bust, rather than admit it was a flop and change their news, they simply filled in the blanks as they wanted to. Now, they didn't air the kinds of nuts and fruits who actually showed up to the rallies. They cherry-picked their guests to make them seem as normal and articulate as possible. That's the opposite approach they take with a genuine protest that they disagree with, like, say, the March for Life rally. Every year, well over 10,000 people march on Parliament Hill against abortion. They're not sponsored by big labor unions. They don't threaten revolution or anarchy. They don't crap on police cars. But because they're pro-life, the CBC downplays them. They grudgingly report the visit, if at all, as briefly as possible. And they do their best to hunt for the craziest person in the crowd and pretend that person speaks for the whole mass. Now, when the CBC loves protesters, like these Occupy nuts or Greenpeace's recent anti-oil sands protests on Parliament Hill, they spend millions of tax dollars promoting them. When they hate a story, like pro-life marchers or more recently the Saudi threats against the oil sands and CTV, the CBC underplays it or goes totally silent. I've got an idea. Maybe I should join the Occupy movement. Let's occupy a mega corporation that mooches $1.1 billion off the taxpayer every year, that gets an annual bailout, that has some of the richest executives in the country, that looks down at working people, that's secretive and refuses to comply with access to information transparency laws, that lobbies the government constantly but refuses to disclose that crony capitalist lobbying in the lobbyist registry. That's right. The mega corporation I'm talking about is the CBC itself. I wonder how the CBC would react to real citizens trying to take back their CBC. I don't wonder. I know. They'd send in security teams with riot gates, like they did when the CBC threw their $1 million party for George Stroumboulopoulos during the film festival, putting up gates so the rest of us couldn't come in. The CBC is the 1%. We're the 99%. In Canada, we know who the mooches are. It's not the banks or the businessmen. They didn't get the bailouts. In this country, the mooches are the government unions and the government broadcaster. Occupy that.